Before a nation was born, before a single shot echoed across a quiet green, there was only an empire and a silence that did not yet know it was about to break. Welcome to Drift to Sleep. I'm truly glad you're here tonight. As you settle in, wherever you are in the world, I invite you to let the day gently fall away. Dim the lights, find a comfortable position, and allow this story to unfold slowly, calmly, and without hurry. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Across continents, across time zones, across oceans, connecting us in one quiet moment of shared rest. And if you find comfort in slow, immersive storytelling designed to help you unwind and drift into sleep, consider subscribing. Here on Drift to Sleep, history isn't rushed, it's experienced, one steady breath at a time. Tonight, we step back into the 18th century, into candlelit rooms, restless harbours, distant kings, and whispered conversations about liberty that would change the world. So close your eyes if you'd like, and let the story begin. Before rebellion had a name, before muskets cracked across village greens, before men spoke openly of independence, there was simply an empire stretching across the Atlantic world. It was vast, confident, and certain of its permanence. In the middle of the 18th century, Britain stood as one of the most powerful empires on earth. Its navy ruled the seas. Its merchants filled the ports of London, Bristol, and Liverpool with goods drawn from distant continents. Sugar from the Caribbean, tea from Asia, tobacco from Virginia, rice from the Carolinas, furs from the northern forests of America. Ships moved in constant motion, triangular routes binding Africa, the Americas, and Europe together in a commercial web both profitable and brutal. Across the ocean lay 13 mainland colonies pressed along the eastern edge of North America. They were not yet a nation. They did not think of themselves as one people. A farmer in Massachusetts had little in common with a planter in South Carolina beyond a shared language and a distant king. The northern colonies were dense with towns, churches, meeting houses, and busy harbours. New England's rocky soil had pushed many toward the sea. Fishing fleets left before dawn, sails fading into grey Atlantic mist. Shipyards rang with hammer blows. Merchants counted barrels of molasses and dried cod. Puritan traditions still shaped much of the culture, though the stern religious intensity of the 17th century had softened into something more commercially minded. Further south, in colonies like Virginia and the Carolinas, the land grew warmer and richer. Tobacco fields stretched wide under humid skies. Rice plantations shimmered near tidal rivers. Indigo stained workers' hands a deep blue. These southern economies depended heavily on enslaved labour, an institution already deeply entrenched and woven into the fabric of wealth and hierarchy. Vast inequalities defined the region, where elite planters lived in large estates, while enslaved Africans endured lives of forced labour and surveillance. Between north and south lay the middle colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. They were culturally diverse and commercially energetic. Dutch merchants lingered in New York. Quakers shaped Pennsylvania. German farmers tilled inland fields. Ports bustled with multiple languages drifting across the docks. Though different in culture and economy, the colonies shared something essential. They were British. They read British newspapers weeks after printing. They followed debates in Parliament. They toasted the King's health in taverns lit by candlelight. Portraits of King George II and later King George III hung in public buildings. Colonial assemblies governed local affairs, but ultimate sovereignty rested in London. For decades, this arrangement seemed stable. The colonies had grown accustomed to a degree of autonomy. British officials were far away. Colonial legislatures levied local taxes and handled internal matters. As long as trade flowed and loyalty remained, the empire functioned with a light touch. But beneath this calm surface, tensions quietly accumulated. The 18th century was an age of global war. European powers clashed repeatedly over trade routes, territory, and influence. In North America, Britain and France competed fiercely. The French had built a vast network stretching from Canada down the Mississippi River, enclosing the British colonies along the Atlantic seaboard. Forts dotted wilderness frontiers. Alliances with native nations shaped power balances in fragile regions. Colonial settlers, eager for land, pushed westward beyond the Appalachian Mountains. There, they collided not only with native nations, but also with French imperial claims. Disputes flared into skirmishes. Skirmishes widened into war. In 1754, conflict ignited in the Ohio River Valley. A young Virginia officer named George Washington stumbled into an early confrontation that would expand far beyond the forests of America. What colonists would call the French and Indian War was one theatre of a much larger global conflict known in Europe as the 7 Years' War. The war spread across continents. Britain and France fought in Europe, the Caribbean, India, West Africa, and North America. Battles raged on oceans and along frontiers. In America, British regular troops marched beside colonial militias. Together they assaulted French forts, endured harsh winters, and advanced through thick wilderness. The war was long and costly. But by 1763, Britain emerged victorious. France ceded Canada and vast territories east of the Mississippi River. Spain, having entered the war on France's side, surrendered Florida to Britain. The map of North America changed dramatically. Britain now controlled an enormous expanse of land. In the colonies, bells rang in celebration. Victory bonfires burned in town squares. Colonists felt pride in their role. They had fought alongside British soldiers. They had shed blood for empire. Many believed this shared sacrifice would strengthen bonds between colony and crown. Yet, the war had come at staggering expense. Britain's national debt had nearly doubled. Maintaining new territories required garrisons, forts, and administrators. The empire had grown, but so had its financial burdens. In London, political leaders faced a difficult question. Who would pay for the cost of victory? Many in Parliament believed the answer was obvious. The colonies had benefited from British military protection. It seemed reasonable, even fair, that they should contribute more directly to imperial defence. From this perspective, new taxes were not oppression, but responsibility. From the colonial perspective, the matter looked different. For generations, colonial assemblies had controlled local taxation. Colonists saw this as a fundamental right of Englishmen. No taxes without representation. They had no representatives in Parliament. While they acknowledged Parliament's authority over imperial trade, internal taxation without colonial consent felt like a violation of established practice. At first, disagreements unfolded in pamphlets and speeches, polite yet firm. Few spoke of independence. Most colonists still considered themselves loyal subjects of the king. They protested policies, not monarchy itself. In 1763, another decision deepened unease. The British government issued the Proclamation Line, forbidding settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. The aim was to stabilize frontier relations with native nations and avoid costly conflicts. To land-hungry colonists, however, the measure felt like betrayal. They had fought, they believed, for access to western lands. Now they were told to remain east of a line drawn across distant maps. Resentment did not explode immediately. It simmered. Trade continued. Crops were harvested. Ships crossed the Atlantic. Life in towns and plantations went on much as before, but conversations shifted subtly. Words like rights and liberty began appearing more frequently in newspapers. Colonial thinkers revisited political philosophies about representation and consent. At this early stage, few could imagine the road ahead. The empire still appeared strong. The king remained respected. Many colonists hoped disputes would be resolved through negotiation and mutual understanding. Yet history often turns not on dramatic declarations at first, but on gradual shifts in expectation. Britain expected greater obedience and financial contribution. The colonies expected continued autonomy and respect for established practices. Both believed themselves reasonable. Between them stretched an ocean not only of water, but of perception. In London, policymakers viewed the colonies as subordinate possessions requiring firmer direction after a costly war. In America, colonists increasingly viewed themselves as partners in an imperial enterprise, deserving consultation rather than command. The difference was subtle, but profound. As winter settled over colonial towns in the years after 1763, fireplaces crackled in quiet homes. Families gathered, unaware that within little more than a decade, the empire they trusted would fracture into war. The American Revolution did not begin with a single gunshot. It began in the slow tightening of policy and principle, in misunderstandings hardened into policy, in pride met by pride. The world was still loyal to the king, but loyalty, like all human bonds, would soon be tested. And once tested, it would never return to what it had been. The war had ended in triumph, but peace, like so many things in history, arrived carrying burdens invisible at first glance. When word spread in 1763 that France had surrendered vast territories in North America, celebrations moved through the colonies in waves. Church bells rang in Boston. Cannons boomed in Charleston. Merchants in Philadelphia spoke confidently of expanded trade, of new lands opening beyond the mountains, of a British future more secure than ever before. The empire seemed not only victorious, but destined. Yet across the Atlantic, in the echoing chambers of Parliament, the mood was far less jubilant. Britain had won a global war, but at staggering cost. The national debt had soared to levels previously unimaginable. Interest payments alone consumed a vast portion of the treasury. The empire had expanded dramatically, but expansion required maintenance. New lands meant new forts. New frontiers meant new garrisons. Tens of thousands of soldiers remained stationed in North America, not only to defend against possible foreign threats, but to stabilize relations with native nations unsettled by shifting territorial claims. In London's view, the colonies had benefited immensely from the war. French power in Canada had vanished. The threat that had long shadowed New England's northern frontier was gone. The Ohio Valley was no longer contested by rival empires. British arms had secured colonial safety and opportunity. It seemed reasonable to many in Parliament that the colonies should help shoulder the financial responsibility. For decades, the British government had largely regulated colonial trade rather than imposing direct internal taxes. Navigation acts had required certain goods to pass through British ports, ensuring imperial benefit. But these measures, though restrictive, were often loosely enforced. Smuggling was common. Customs officials were few. The relationship between Britain and its colonies had functioned through a kind of practical flexibility. After 1763, that flexibility began to narrow. Prime Minister George Grenville, determined to stabilise Britain's finances, believed the empire required firmer administration. Revenue must be raised. Colonial governance must be made more efficient. Smuggling must be curbed. The first major step came with the Sugar Act of 1764. This law reduced the existing tax on molasses imported from non-British colonies. But more importantly, it strengthened enforcement. Customs officials received expanded authority. Smugglers faced stricter penalties. Vice Admiralty courts, operating without juries, handled violations. To British officials, this seemed modest and rational. The tax was lower than before. Enforcement was simply more consistent. To many colonists, however, the principle felt dangerous. Merchants in New England, long accustomed to trading with French and Spanish Caribbean islands, saw profits threatened. But beyond economics lay something deeper. Colonists began articulating an argument rooted in political philosophy. Taxation without representation violated their rights as Englishmen. They did not yet reject Parliament's authority entirely. Rather, they insisted that internal taxation required consent through elected representatives. Since the colonies had no representatives in Parliament, they argued, such taxes were unconstitutional. Pamphlets began circulating with increasing frequency. Printers inked essays questioning imperial policy. Town meetings debated resolutions. The language of rights, once reserved for abstract discussion, entered daily conversation. Still, many hoped tensions would subside. But in 1765, Parliament introduced a measure that would ignite far broader resistance. The Stamp Act required that many printed materials in the colonies carry an official stamp purchased from British authorities. Legal documents, newspapers, pamphlets, playing cards, even almanacs would be taxed. Unlike trade duties, this was a direct internal tax affecting a wide range of colonists. For the first time, farmers signing deeds, lawyers filing cases, printers publishing newspapers, and ordinary citizens purchasing paper goods would all feel Parliament's reach directly. The reaction was swift and intense. In Virginia, a young legislator named Patrick Henry rose in the House of Burgesses and delivered a series of resolutions asserting that only the colonial assembly had the right to tax Virginians. His speech, bold and edged with defiance, stirred deep emotion. Though some of his most radical words were struck from the official record, their spirit lingered. In Boston, crowds gathered in protest. Effigies of stamp distributors were hung from trees. Demonstrations grew unruly. Homes of officials were attacked. Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson's house was ransacked, his belongings destroyed in the fury of the mob. Organizations calling themselves Sons of Liberty emerged, coordinating resistance across colonies. They communicated through letters, shared strategies, and encouraged non-importation agreements. Pledges not to buy British goods until the tax was repealed. Women participated as well, organising spinning bees to produce homespun cloth in place of imported textiles. In quiet domestic spaces, political resistance took material form. What made the Stamp Act crisis particularly significant was its breadth. Unlike trade regulations affecting primarily merchants, this law touched nearly every literate colonist. Printers, whose livelihoods depended on paper, became vocal critics. Newspapers filled with essays condemning Parliament's overreach. In October 1765, delegates from 9 colonies gathered in New York for what became known as the Stamp Act Congress. They drafted petitions affirming loyalty to the Crown, while firmly rejecting Parliament's authority to impose direct taxes without colonial representation. The tone remained respectful, but the message was unmistakable. Britain faced not isolated protests, but coordinated intercolonial resistance. Back in London, merchants felt the effects of colonial boycotts. Exports declined. Economic pressure mounted. Parliament debated the wisdom of continuing the policy. In 1766, the Stamp Act was repealed. Celebrations erupted in the colonies. Bells rang once more. Many believed the crisis had passed, that mutual understanding had prevailed. But Parliament simultaneously passed the Declaratory Act, asserting its authority to legislate for the colonies, in all cases whatsoever. The repeal soothed immediate tensions, yet the underlying disagreement remained unresolved. The colonies believed they had defended constitutional rights. Parliament believed it had merely adjusted tactics while preserving ultimate authority. For a brief moment, calm returned. Trade resumed. Boycotts faded. Conversations shifted back toward daily concerns. Fields were planted. Ships sailed. Children were born into households that had tasted protest but not war. Yet something irreversible had occurred. The Stamp Act crisis had drawn the colonies into shared political action. Delegates had met across colonial lines. Correspondence networks had formed. The idea that disparate colonies might unite in defense of common rights had moved from theory into lived experience. Moreover, resistance had revealed power. Organised boycotts had influenced British merchants. Public demonstrations had forced attention. Ordinary colonists had glimpsed their collective strength. In Britain, frustration simmered. Many officials viewed colonial protests as ingratitude. The Empire had defended them at enormous expense. Was modest taxation truly unreasonable? In the colonies, suspicion deepened. If Parliament could impose one internal tax, what prevented another? What prevented more? In 1767, new measures arrived, the Townshend Acts. These imposed duties on imported goods such as glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. Revenue would pay salaries of royal governors and judges, reducing colonial assemblies' financial leverage over officials. Again, Parliament saw administrative efficiency. Again, colonists saw encroachment. Non-importation agreements resurfaced. Merchants pledged restraint. Women once more turned to homespun production. Tensions though quieter than during the Stamp Act crisis, persisted like an undercurrent. British troops were dispatched to Boston in 1768 to maintain order and enforce customs regulations. Their red uniforms became a constant presence in narrow streets. Soldiers competed with locals for jobs. Minor altercations flared into resentment. The city, once merely a port of commerce and debate, now felt like an occupied space to many of its inhabitants. Through these years, few colonists openly demanded independence. Most sought restoration of what they believed had been the balanced relationship of earlier decades. They toasted the king even as they criticised Parliament. They distinguished between loyalty to the crown and opposition to specific policies. Yet step by step, policy by policy, misunderstanding hardened. In London, authority felt challenged. In America, liberty felt threatened. The cost of victory in 1763 had not been measured solely in pounds sterling. It had unsettled expectations, altered governance, and introduced a pattern of action and reaction that grew increasingly difficult to contain. Empires often assume endurance. Subjects often assume stability. But history moves through the quiet accumulation of grievances as much as through grand declarations. By the close of the 1760s, the Atlantic world felt different than it had a decade earlier. Trust had thinned. Words had sharpened. Soldiers stood where once there had been only merchants and fishermen. The war against France had united Britain and its colonies against a common enemy. Peace was slowly teaching them to see one another as adversaries. And though reconciliation still seemed possible, the space for it was narrowing with each passing year. Winter came hard to Boston in 1770. The harbour wind cut through wool and leather, sweeping down narrow streets and rattling shutters long after nightfall. Snow gathered in uneven drifts along crooked lanes. Chimneys breathed thin grey smoke into a pale sky. Beneath the surface stillness of the season, tension lay coiled. British soldiers had been stationed in the city for nearly 2 years. Their arrival in 1768 had been presented as a necessary measure to enforce customs laws and maintain order. Yet their presence had never felt neutral. Red-coated regiments drilled in public squares. Sentries stood guard before government buildings. Drums echoed at dawn and dusk. To some, they represented imperial authority. To others, they symbolized intrusion. Boston was not a large city. Its population hovered around 15,000. Its streets were intimate, its social circles overlapping. Soldiers and civilians crossed paths daily at markets, taverns and docks. Competition for employment sharpened resentment. Off-duty soldiers sometimes sought work unloading ships or hauling goods, accepting wages lower than those demanded by local labourers. Arguments flared. Insults travelled quickly through tavern rooms thick with pipe smoke. Words grew harsher with each passing month. On the evening of March 5th, 1770, a confrontation began, not with a grand political speech, but with a boy and a sentry. Near the custom house on King Street, a young apprentice reportedly taunted a British soldier, accusing an officer of failing to pay a bill. The exchange escalated. Voices rose. The sentry struck the boy with his musket. Bystanders gathered. Snowballs were thrown, some packed with ice. Shouts filled the air. "Fire if you dare," voices taunted. The lone sentry, increasingly surrounded, called for assistance. Captain Thomas Preston arrived with additional soldiers. They formed a defensive line, muskets loaded, bayonets fixed. Before them stood a growing crowd of townspeople, sailors, labourers, apprentices, pressing closer despite warnings. Church bells began to ring, not as a signal of celebration, but as an alarm. More citizens poured into the street, drawn by sound and rumour. What happened next, unfolded in seconds yet, would echo for years. Amid shouting, shoving, and the crack of thrown debris, a shot rang out. Whether accidental or deliberate remains debated by historians. Then another followed. Smoke filled the cold air. Musket fire erupted in a ragged volley. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead or dying on the snow-streaked street. Among them was Crispus Attucks, a man of African and native descent, a sailor by trade. His body, along with the others, was carried away as shock rippled through the city. Blood darkened the snow. By morning, Boston was transformed. News spread rapidly through pamphlets and word of mouth. Engravings soon depicted the scene in stark, dramatic lines. Orderly redcoats firing mercilessly into an innocent crowd. The event was quickly named the Boston Massacre. The term itself shaped perception. Massacre suggested deliberate slaughter, not chaotic confrontation. Patriot leaders understood the power of language and image. Paul Revere's widely circulated engraving portrayed disciplined soldiers firing on defenseless civilians under the command of Captain Preston. Though simplified and propagandistic, the image seared itself into colonial consciousness. Yet the reality had been more complex. The crowd had been aggressive. The soldiers had been surrounded and pelted. Fear and confusion had mingled with anger. It was a volatile mixture in which discipline faltered. Even so, 5 colonists were dead at the hands of British troops on a colonial street. In the aftermath, a delicate moment unfolded. Patriot leaders sought justice, but also legitimacy. They understood that mob vengeance could undermine their claims of defending law and liberty. Captain Preston and the soldiers involved were arrested and charged with murder. To the surprise of some, they were defended in court by John Adams, a respected lawyer who believed in the principle of fair trial. Adams argued that the soldiers had acted in self-defense amid a threatening crowd. The trial lasted several days. Witnesses offered conflicting accounts. Ultimately, 6 soldiers were acquitted. 2 were found guilty of manslaughter and branded on the thumb as punishment. The verdict demonstrated something significant. Even amid deep tension, colonial courts upheld legal procedure. Patriots could claim moral high ground, having allowed due process rather than succumbing to mob retribution. Yet the emotional impact of the event lingered. Funerals for the victims drew large crowds. Bells tolled solemnly. The dead were remembered as martyrs to liberty. Annual commemorations kept memory alive. Speeches retold the story, emphasizing innocence and tyranny. The Townshend duties, already controversial, came under renewed scrutiny. Parliament, recognizing the volatility of the situation, repealed most of the duties in 1770, except for the tax on tea. That single retained duty, modest in revenue but significant in principle, would carry outsized consequence. For a few years after the Boston Massacre, tensions eased slightly. Trade resumed. The immediate crisis seemed to have cooled. British troops were withdrawn from Boston to an island in the harbour, reducing daily friction. But beneath the apparent calm, distrust had deepened. colonial leaders continued organizing through committees of correspondence, exchanging letters between towns and colonies to coordinate responses to imperial policy. These networks strengthened intercolonial unity. Ideas traveled faster. Grievances became shared property rather than isolated complaints. Meanwhile, in Britain, Parliament maintained its position. Authority must remain clear. The empire could not function if colonial assemblies claimed equal sovereignty. The tea tax, though small, symbolized that authority. By the early 1770s, a new complication emerged. The British East India Company, burdened by surplus tea and financial strain, sought relief. Parliament responded with the Tea Act of 1773. The Act allowed the company to sell tea directly to the colonies at reduced prices, undercutting smugglers and colonial merchants. From a purely economic standpoint, colonial consumers would pay less for tea, yet the tax remained embedded in the price, affirming Parliament's right to tax. For many colonists, this was the heart of the issue. In ports along the eastern seaboard, ships carrying East India Company tea arrived to mixed reception. In some cities, tea was quietly returned to Britain. In Boston, however, the situation grew tense. Governor Thomas Hutchinson insisted that the tea be landed and duties paid. Meetings were held at the Old South Meeting House. Crowds debated options. Deadlines loomed, after which customs officials could seize cargo and unload it by force. On the night of December 16th, 1773, a group of men, some disguised as Mohawk Indians, others simply darkened against recognition, moved silently toward Griffin's Wharf. They boarded 3 ships and worked methodically through the cold night, breaking open chests of tea and dumping their contents into the harbour. The water darkened with leaves. The Boston Tea Party, as it would later be known, was both theatrical and calculated. No other property was damaged. No crew members were harmed. The action was precise, focused solely on the tea. When morning came, the harbour carried the scent of steeping leaves. In London, reaction was swift and severe. Parliament viewed the destruction of private property as open defiance. If Boston was not punished decisively, imperial authority would erode further. In 1774, a series of measures known in Britain as the Coercive Acts were passed. In the colonies, they became known as the Intolerable Acts. Boston Harbour was closed until the tea was paid for. Massachusetts's charter was altered, limiting town meetings and increasing royal control. British officials accused of crimes in the colonies could be tried in Britain. Quartering provisions for troops were expanded. The intent was clear: isolate and discipline Massachusetts. But instead of isolating Boston, the measures stirred sympathy throughout the colonies. Supplies were sent from Virginia, Pennsylvania, and elsewhere to support the city under blockade. What had been a local dispute increasingly felt continental. The closing of Boston Harbour transformed political resistance into something broader. Colonies that had once viewed Massachusetts' radicalism with caution now saw imperial overreach threatening their own liberties. In September 1774, delegates from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They debated grievances and coordinated responses. While still professing loyalty to King George III, they asserted colonial rights and called for renewed boycotts of British goods. The empire stood at a crossroads. Snow would fall again in New England. Ships would creak in frozen harbours. Candles would flicker in meeting houses where men spoke carefully of rights and duties. But the distance between protest and war was shrinking. On a winter night in Boston, musket fire had cracked across King Street, staining snow with blood. It had not yet been revolution, but it had shown how quickly order could fracture. And once people have seen blood spilled in the name of authority, the world never feels quite as stable again. By the autumn of 1774, the empire no longer felt steady. The closing of Boston Harbor had not subdued Massachusetts. Instead, it had stirred something wider and more durable than outrage. Wagons loaded with grain and livestock rolled toward the beleaguered town from distant colonies. Letters of solidarity crossed muddy roads and restless seas. Where Parliament had intended isolation, it had produced connection. In Philadelphia, delegates to the First Continental Congress met in Carpenter's Hall beneath high windows that admitted the soft light of early fall. They were men of different temperaments and backgrounds, planters from Virginia, merchants from New York, lawyers from Massachusetts. Some were cautious, others fiery. Few spoke openly of independence. Most still hoped for reconciliation. Yet their gathering itself marked a profound shift. For the first time, colonies had assembled not merely to petition separately, but to deliberate collectively. They drafted a declaration of rights and grievances, asserting that Parliament had no authority to tax or legislate for them internally. They organised a Continental Association to enforce non-importation agreements. They pledged mutual support should any colony face further coercion. When Congress adjourned, delegates returned home to implement resolutions that quietly expanded local power. Committees of safety formed, militias drilled more regularly, powder and shot were inventoried. These measures were described as defensive, prudent, temporary. But defense has a way of preparing men for offense. In Massachusetts, General Thomas Gage served as both royal governor and military commander. He was not a reckless man. He understood the volatility of his position. Boston remained occupied by British troops, but the countryside beyond the city had slipped from effective royal control. Local assemblies met in defiance of the altered charter. Militias organised into what became known as Minutemen. Citizen soldiers prepared to muster at short notice. Through the winter of 1774 and into early 1775, rumours thickened the air. British patrols scouted rural roads. Colonial riders carried messages through cold night winds. Each side suspected the other of preparing for violence, yet neither wished to be blamed for beginning it. London, impatient with colonial defiance, instructed Gage to restore order and seize military supplies being stockpiled by the rebels. Intelligence reached him that arms and powder were stored in Concord, a small town some 20 miles northwest of Boston. The plan was conceived with care. On the night of April 18th, 1775, approximately 700 British regulars would march quietly from Boston to Concord, destroy the supplies, and return before significant resistance could assemble. But secrecy proved elusive. Boston was a town of watchers. Patriot networks were alert. As British troops prepared to cross the Charles River under cover of darkness, riders were already moving through the countryside. Paul Revere and William Dawes set out along separate routes, warning that regulars were on the march. Lanterns briefly shone from the tower of the Old North Church, signalling the route of departure. Across fields and along winding roads, doors were knocked upon in urgent rhythm. The regulars are coming out. In the quiet hours before dawn on April 19th, militia companies stirred from sleep. Farmers left ploughs half repaired in barns. Blacksmiths pulled on coats over linen shirts. Muskets were taken down from hooks above hearths. Powder horns were filled with steady hands. In the town of Lexington, a small company of militia gathered on the green under Captain John Parker. They were not numerous, perhaps 77 men. They stood in loose formation, uncertain whether they would face confrontation or simply witness the passing of troops. As the British column approached at first light, their drums beating a measured cadence, the two groups came within sight of one another. The sun had not yet risen fully. The air held a fragile stillness. Major John Pitcairn rode forward, ordering the militia to disperse. Accounts differ as to the exact words spoken, but the message was clear. Lay down your arms and go home. Captain Parker, reportedly ill with consumption, yet steady in bearing, instructed his men not to fire unless fired upon. They began to withdraw, some turning, others lingering. Then a shot rang out. To this day, the origin of that first shot remains uncertain. It may have come from a nervous militiaman, a British soldier, or even a bystander. What is certain is that within seconds, chaos erupted. British troops fired a volley. Militiamen scattered. Smoke drifted across the green. When the firing ceased, 8 colonists lay dead or dying. 10 more were wounded. 1 British soldier was injured. The British column moved on toward Concord. At the North Bridge in Concord later that morning, colonial militia companies gathered in greater numbers. As British troops searched the town and destroyed some supplies, tensions mounted. Smoke from burning materials rose against the sky. Militiamen advanced toward the bridge where a detachment of regulars stood guard. Again, orders were shouted. Again, confusion blurred intention. This time, the militia fired a coordinated volley. British soldiers returned fire, but soon began retreating toward the main column. The skirmish at the North Bridge marked a turning point. Colonial forces had not merely endured fire, they had returned it in organised resistance. The British began their long march back to Boston under a strengthening sun. Along the road, militia companies assembled in growing numbers, firing from behind stone walls, trees and barns. The retreat became harrowing. Regulars, trained for formal battlefields, found themselves under constant harassment from concealed marksmen. By the time the column staggered back into Boston that evening, nearly 300 British soldiers had been killed, wounded, or missing. Colonial casualties numbered fewer but were nonetheless grave. The day's events travelled swiftly by rider and rumour. Within days, news had reached distant colonies. The confrontation at Lexington and Concord was no longer a local clash. It was war. Yet even then, many clung to hope that reconciliation might still be possible. The Second Continental Congress convened in May 1775 in Philadelphia. Delegates faced a stark reality. Armed conflict had begun, but independence had not been declared. They moved cautiously but decisively. George Washington of Virginia was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the newly formed Continental Army, a choice meant to signal unity between northern and southern colonies. Efforts were made to secure supplies, organize regiments, and establish legitimacy. At the same time, Congress drafted the Olive Branch Petition, a final appeal to King George III expressing loyalty and requesting intervention against what they described as parliamentary overreach. The petition would never achieve its intended effect. By summer, British reinforcements arrived in Boston under Generals William Howe, Henry Clinton, and John Burgoyne. The city remained occupied, but colonial forces now surrounded it in what became the Siege of Boston. Farmers and tradesmen encamped on hills overlooking the harbour, their tents visible against green slopes. On June 17, 1775, tensions culminated in a major engagement on the Charlestown Peninsula. Colonial forces had fortified Breed's Hill overnight, prompting a British assault. The Battle of Bunker Hill, as it came to be known, unfolded beneath a hot June sun. British troops advanced in disciplined lines up the hillside, red coats bright against smoke and grass. Colonial defenders, low on ammunition, were instructed to hold fire until the enemy was close. Twice the British advanced and were driven back with heavy losses. On the third assault, with colonial powder nearly exhausted, the redcoats overran the position. The colonists retreated in relative order. Though technically a British victory, the cost was staggering. More than 1,000 British casualties underscored the ferocity of colonial resistance. It was no mere rebellion of scattered mobs. It was organised defiance capable of inflicting serious damage. In London, the king declared the colonies in open rebellion. Hopes for swift restoration of order dimmed. In America, the line had been crossed. Blood had been shed not in isolated incident, but in sustained battle. The idea of independence, once whispered cautiously, began to surface more boldly. Still, through the smoke of Bunker Hill and the uneasy quiet that followed, uncertainty lingered. War had begun, but its outcome was unknowable. Empires had crushed rebellions before. Armies had dispersed insurrections with brutal efficiency. The British military remained one of the most formidable forces in the world. Yet something intangible had shifted. Ordinary men had stood against imperial troops and held their ground. Farmers had fired upon professional soldiers and survived the exchange. Colonies that once quarrelled among themselves now shared common cause. The road from Lexington had led not back to submission, but forward into revolution. And as summer deepened into autumn, the 13 colonies found themselves poised between loyalty and separation, between empire and something entirely new. The next step would not come quietly. When summer settled over Philadelphia in 1775, the air inside the Pennsylvania State House grew heavy with heat and uncertainty. Windows were opened for relief, yet little breeze found its way into the chamber where delegates gathered once more. The Second Continental Congress did not convene as revolutionaries declaring a new nation. They assembled as men attempting to manage a crisis that had already outrun their control. Outside Boston, colonial forces still encircled the city. Inside Boston, British troops waited for orders and reinforcements. The countryside was tense but resolute. Militia companies drilled. Powder was scarce. Discipline was uneven. Supplies were improvised. What had begun in April as spontaneous resistance was slowly becoming organized war. The Congress faced immediate practical demands. An army had formed in fact. It now required structure in law. On June 14, 1775, the delegates voted to establish the Continental Army. The following day, they appointed George Washington as commander-in-chief. Washington's selection was deliberate. He was not the most vocal radical, nor the most experienced officer in European warfare, but he carried symbolic weight. A Virginian planter of dignified bearing, he embodied Southern participation in what had thus far been centered in New England. By placing a Virginian at the head of an army surrounding Boston, Congress signaled that this was not merely a Massachusetts rebellion. It was a continental struggle. Washington accepted the commission with solemn restraint, declining a salary and asking only that his expenses be covered. He departed Philadelphia almost immediately, traveling north to assume command of a force that was more aspiration than institution. Upon arrival near Boston, Washington found enthusiasm but also disorder. Soldiers lacked uniform clothing. Muskets varied in quality. Terms of enlistment were short, some expiring by year's end. Camp sanitation was poor. The army resembled a gathering of determined militias rather than a cohesive fighting force. Yet determination was real. Washington set about imposing discipline. He established clearer chains of command, standardized regimental structures, and worked to instill professional conduct. It was not easy. Many soldiers viewed themselves as citizen defenders rather than subordinates in a standing army. Obedience to distant authority ran against habits of local autonomy. Still, slowly, a semblance of order emerged. Meanwhile, Congress pursued a parallel path. Even as they prepared for war, they drafted the Olive Branch Petition, one final appeal to King George III. The petition affirmed loyalty and asked the king to intercede against Parliament's harsh measures. The document crossed the Atlantic. By the time it arrived, events had overtaken its plea. In August 1775, the king issued a proclamation of rebellion, declaring the colonies in open revolt. He refused to receive the petition. The possibility of peaceful reconciliation narrowed to near invisibility. Autumn deepened. The siege of Boston continued in tense stalemate. Skirmishes flared occasionally, but neither side launched decisive action. Both lacked sufficient strength for bold maneuver. Winter loomed, threatening hardship for armies ill-prepared for sustained campaign. In January 1776, a new voice entered the public conversation with startling clarity. Thomas Paine, an English immigrant recently arrived in America, published a pamphlet titled Common Sense. Written in accessible language and printed in large numbers, it spread rapidly through towns and countryside. Paine did not argue cautiously for rights within empire. He dismissed monarchy itself as an absurdity. He framed independence not as radical, but as rational and necessary. He asked why a vast continent should be governed by a small island. He described hereditary rule as an affront to natural equality. He called for immediate separation and the creation of a republic. The pamphlet struck a chord. Where many colonial leaders had hesitated to speak openly of independence, Paine spoke without reserve. His words reached artisans, farmers, labourers, people who might not read dense political treatises but could grasp his direct appeals. Common Sense sold in the tens of thousands, extraordinary for the time. Its arguments entered tavern debates and fireside discussions. Independence, once unspoken in polite assemblies, became imaginable. As winter turned towards spring in 1776, Washington executed a bold maneuver around Boston. Artillery captured months earlier at Fort Ticonderoga had been dragged across frozen ground by Colonel Henry Knox in an arduous journey. In March, these cannons were positioned on Dorchester Heights, overlooking the city and harbour. British General William Howe recognised the threat immediately. The elevated guns made Boston untenable. Rather than risk catastrophic assault, Howe chose evacuation. On March 17, 1776, British troops and loyalist civilians boarded ships and departed Boston Harbour. The siege ended without a major battle. Washington entered the city to public acclaim. The evacuation marked a psychological triumph. For the first time, British forces had withdrawn from a major colonial city under pressure from the Continental Army. It suggested possibility, yet even as one front quieted, another loomed. British strategy shifted toward New York, a city with a deep harbour and strategic location between New England and the southern colonies. Throughout spring and summer of 1776, British forces assembled in massive numbers. Transports crowded the Atlantic. By July, tens of thousands of soldiers, including German auxiliaries known as Hessians, gathered on Staten Island. The scale of British preparation dwarfed anything yet seen in the conflict. Meanwhile, Congress confronted a decision long deferred. On June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a resolution declaring that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. Debate followed, intense and searching. Some delegates worried that independence was premature. Others believed delay dangerous. A committee was appointed to draft a formal declaration should the resolution pass. Thomas Jefferson, young and eloquent, undertook the principal writing, with input from John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. Jefferson's draft reached beyond immediate grievances. It articulated a philosophy. Governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. All men were created equal, endowed with unalienable rights. When government became destructive of those ends, the people had the right to alter or abolish it. The language drew from Enlightenment thought, from John Locke and others, but it gave those ideas luminous expression. On July 2nd, 1776, Congress voted in favour of independence. 2 days later, on July 4th, they adopted the Declaration of Independence, with some revisions to Jefferson's draft. Church bells rang in Philadelphia. Copies were printed and dispatched to states and army camps. In New York, the document was read aloud to Washington's troops. Soon after, a crowd pulled down a statue of King George III, melting it into musket balls. The break was no longer theoretical. It was proclaimed. Yet declaration did not secure victory. It clarified stakes. In late August 1776, British forces launched their assault on New York. The Battle of Long Island became the largest engagement of the war. British troops executed a flanking maneuver, overwhelming American positions. Washington's army faced potential destruction. Under cover of fog and night, Washington orchestrated a daring evacuation across the East River to Manhattan, preserving his army but conceding the field. Defeats followed in quick succession. Manhattan fell. Fort Washington was captured, along with thousands of American prisoners. The Continental Army retreated across New Jersey, pursued by British forces. Morale plummeted. Enlistments expired. Soldiers slipped away to return home. By December 1776, the Revolution seemed fragile. Washington's army crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania, reduced and exhausted. The British believed rebellion nearly crushed. Winter quarters were established. Confidence returned to imperial ranks. But Washington understood that without a dramatic reversal, the army might dissolve entirely. On the night of December 25, 1776, amid sleet and biting wind, Washington led approximately 2,400 men back across the ice-choked Delaware. The crossing was perilous. Boats struggled against current. Artillery creaked over frozen ground. At dawn, on December 26th, American forces surprised a Hessian garrison at Trenton. The engagement was brief but decisive. Nearly 1,000 prisoners were taken. Days later, Washington achieved another success at Princeton. These victories were small in scale compared to earlier defeats, but their psychological impact was immense. They demonstrated resilience. They revived morale. They suggested that the revolution remained alive. As the year closed, the American cause stood transformed. What had begun as protest against taxation had evolved into declared independence, defended by an organized, if fragile, army. The colonies were no longer subjects petitioning for redress. They were states in rebellion against empire, staking everything on uncertain outcome. The war would grow broader still. Foreign powers watched with interest. France, long humiliated by defeat in the 7 Years' War, saw opportunity in Britain's difficulties. But that chapter had yet to unfold. For now, amid winter camps and candlelit chambers, a new nation existed, not in stability, but in defiance. It had declared itself before it had secured itself. And history would test whether declaration alone could sustain a revolution against one of the world's greatest empires. The winter victories at Trenton and Princeton did not end the war, but they altered its rhythm. What had felt like collapse in December 1776 became endurance in January 1777. The Continental Army, though still fragile, had demonstrated that it could strike, withdraw, and survive. Survival, in that moment, was everything. As spring approached, British strategy shifted once again. London's ministers believed the rebellion strongest in New England, and reasoned that if that region could be isolated from the middle and southern colonies, resistance might fracture. A plan emerged that centered on controlling the Hudson River corridor, severing New England from the rest of the colonies. General John Burgoyne would lead a force south from Canada along Lake Champlain and the Hudson Valley. A second column under Colonel Barry St. Leger would advance eastward from Lake Ontario. Meanwhile, General William Howe, based in New York, was expected to move northward to meet them. The convergence would trap New England. On paper, the plan was logical. In execution, it depended on coordination across difficult terrain and long distances. While Burgoyne prepared his expedition, Washington faced ongoing challenges. The Continental Army's enlistments were inconsistent. Supplies remained scarce. Congress struggled to finance the war. Paper currency depreciated rapidly. Farmers were reluctant to accept payment that might lose value before it could be spent. Throughout 1777, Washington maneuvered to protect Philadelphia, the seat of Congress and symbolic heart of the Revolution. Howe, however, chose a different path. Rather than moving north to meet Burgoyne, he sailed southward, landing near the head of Chesapeake Bay. His aim was to capture Philadelphia directly. The maneuver forced Washington into defensive engagements. In September 1777, the armies clashed at Brandywine Creek. British forces outflanked American positions, compelling Washington to retreat. Weeks later, the British entered Philadelphia. Congress fled the city, relocating first to Lancaster and then to York, Pennsylvania. The capital of the fledgling nation now lay in enemy hands. Yet even as Howe occupied Philadelphia, events in the north unfolded in ways that would reshape the war entirely. Burgoyne's march south from Canada began with confidence. His force included British regulars, German auxiliaries, and native allies. Initially, progress seemed steady. Fort Ticonderoga fell in July 1777, a significant early victory. But the deeper Burgoyne advanced into upstate New York, the more vulnerable he became. Supply lines stretched thin. American forces, under General Horatio Gates and aided by officers such as Benedict Arnold, gathered strength. Local militias harassed British movements. Roads were obstructed. Trees were felled across pathways. Supplies dwindled. In September and October 1777, the opposing forces met near Saratoga. The engagements at Freeman's Farm and Bemis Heights were fierce. American resistance stiffened. Burgoyne's options narrowed. On October 17, 1777, surrounded and with no viable escape, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army. The victory at Saratoga was monumental. It demonstrated that American forces could defeat a major British field army in open campaign. More importantly, it altered international perception. In European courts, particularly in France, skepticism about the American cause began to wane. France had long watched Britain's troubles with interest. Since the end of the 7 Years' War, French leaders sought opportunity to weaken their rival. American victory at Saratoga provided proof that the rebellion had substance. In early 1778, France formally recognized the United States and entered into alliance. The Treaty of Alliance committed France to military support. Soon after, French naval and land forces would join the conflict. The war was no longer a colonial rebellion. It was an international struggle. Meanwhile, Washington's army endured one of its most trying seasons. After the loss of Philadelphia, Washington chose to encamp at Valley Forge for the winter of 1777 to 1778. The location allowed monitoring of British movements while keeping the army intact. The winter was severe. Snow blanketed the ground. Supply shortages grew acute. Many soldiers lacked adequate clothing. Barefoot men left bloody footprints in frozen earth. Disease spread through crowded huts. Hunger gnawed at morale. Yet Valley Forge was not solely a story of suffering. It was also a crucible of transformation. Baron Friedrich von Steuben, a Prussian officer volunteering his service, arrived at camp and began drilling the troops in European military discipline. Through careful instruction and standardized procedures, he improved maneuverability and cohesion. Under von Steuben's guidance, the Continental Army became more professional. Soldiers learned to load and fire more efficiently, to execute coordinated movements, to maintain formation under stress. By spring 1778, the army that emerged from Valley Forge was hardened, not only by privation, but by training. In June 1778, British forces evacuated Philadelphia, marching across New Jersey toward New York. Washington pursued and engaged them at the Battle of Monmouth. The battle was tactically inconclusive, fought under intense heat. Yet the Continental Army held its ground against British regulars in sustained engagement. The war shifted again. British strategy began focusing increasingly on the southern colonies, where they believed loyalist support stronger. Savannah, Georgia, fell to British forces in late 1778. Charleston, South Carolina, would follow in 1780 after a lengthy siege. The Southern campaign proved brutal. Civil War dimensions intensified as neighbors chose opposing sides. Skirmishes, raids, and reprisals scarred the countryside. Leaders such as Nathaniel Greene and Daniel Morgan adopted flexible tactics, avoiding decisive annihilation while wearing down British forces. In the north, French naval presence altered calculations. The arrival of French fleets challenged British control of coastal waters. Coordination between American and French commanders, though sometimes strained by language and cultural differences, gradually strengthened. Across the Atlantic, Britain now faced not only American resistance, but also French hostility. Spain would later enter the war on France's side, further stretching British resources. What had begun as imperial dispute had expanded into global conflict once more. Through these years, uncertainty persisted. Victory did not follow declaration in a straight line. There were triumphs and reversals, hope and despair. Yet a pattern had emerged. Each time the American cause seemed near collapse, it adapted. After New York, there was Trenton. After Philadelphia, there was Saratoga. After Valley Forge, there was renewed discipline. The revolution endured not because it advanced without setback, but because it survived each setback without surrender. By the close of 1778, the war had settled into a prolonged contest. Neither side could claim decisive dominance. The British held major cities, yet struggled to control the countryside. The Americans lacked resources, but possessed growing international support. Independence, once an idea printed on parchment, now rested on endurance across years. The question was no longer whether fighting had begun. It was whether endurance would outlast empire. The answer would unfold slowly, across southern fields, contested seas, and one final campaign that neither side could yet foresee. History rarely declares its conclusions in advance, but the shape of the revolution was becoming clearer. It would not be won in a single, decisive moment. It would be won by persistence. By 1779, the war had changed in character. The early years had centered on New England and the Middle Colonies, on sieges and set-piece battles near Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. Now the conflict drifted southward into landscapes of humid air and vast plantations, where loyalties were divided and the lines between soldier and civilian blurred more dangerously than before. British leaders believed the southern colonies offered opportunity. They calculated that loyalist sentiment ran stronger in Georgia and the Carolinas than in the north. If royal authority could be restored there, a wave of support might roll upward, isolating and crushing rebellion from below. The strategy began with force. In December 1778, British troops captured Savannah, securing Georgia's principal port. The following year saw further advances, but it was in 1780 that the Southern campaign deepened into something harsher. In May 1780, after a protracted siege, Charleston, South Carolina, fell to British forces under General Sir Henry Clinton. The surrender was devastating for the American cause. Thousands of Continental soldiers were taken prisoner. It marked one of the worst defeats of the war for the United States. With Charleston secured, British command passed in the South to General Charles Cornwallis. His mission was not merely to hold coastal cities, but to pacify the interior. That task would prove far more difficult. The southern backcountry was not easily subdued. Farms were scattered across rolling hills and dense forests. Communication was uneven. Allegiance was often personal rather than ideological. Some families remained loyal to the crown. Others supported independence. Many simply wished to be left alone. But neutrality grew impossible. As British forces pushed inland, they relied heavily on loyalist militias to maintain control. Patriot militias, in turn, mobilized to resist. Skirmishes erupted across the countryside. Raids burned homes. Prisoners were sometimes treated with little mercy. The war took on the character of civil conflict. One such flashpoint occurred in August 1780 at Camden, South Carolina. American forces under General Horatio Gates, hero of Saratoga, faced Cornwallis's army. The battle ended in crushing defeat for the Americans. Militia units broke under pressure. Gates fled the field. Once again, the Southern campaign seemed lost. Yet out of defeat emerged adaptation. Leadership in the Southern Continental Army passed to General Nathaniel Greene, a commander of steady temperament and strategic patience. Greene understood that his forces could not defeat Cornwallis in direct confrontation. Instead, he adopted a strategy of division and maneuver. He split his army, sending General Daniel Morgan westward while he maintained another force elsewhere. The goal was to stretch British lines, compel Cornwallis to chase multiple threats, and exhaust his resources. In January 1781, Morgan's detachment met British Colonel Banastra Tarleton at the Battle of Cowpens. Morgan arranged his troops in layered lines, anticipating Tarleton's aggressive tactics. The result was a decisive American victory. British losses were heavy, and morale shifted perceptibly. Cornwallis, angered but determined, pursued Greene across North Carolina in what became known as the Race to the Dam. Greene avoided full engagement, retreating strategically, preserving his army while forcing Cornwallis deeper into hostile territory. In March 1781, the armies clashed at Guilford Courthouse. The battle was fierce and costly. Though Cornwallis technically held the field at day's end, his casualties were severe. The victory weakened rather than strengthened his position. British forces had won ground but lost strength. Cornwallis now faced a dilemma. The interior proved resistant and draining. Loyalist support was less reliable than anticipated. Supply lines were tenuous. Rather than continue grinding inland campaigns, he turned his attention toward the coast, marching into Virginia in hopes of linking with British naval support. Virginia, long a relatively stable base for the Revolution, now became central. Throughout 1781, British raids struck coastal towns and supply depots. Benedict Arnold, once a hero at Saratoga, now infamous for his 1780 attempt to betray West Point to the British. led destructive expeditions through his native state under British commission. Yet American resistance stiffened. Marquis de Lafayette, the young French nobleman who had volunteered early in the war, maneuvered carefully against Cornwallis, avoiding decisive defeat while shadowing British movements. Meanwhile, far beyond the southern fields, a convergence of larger forces was unfolding. Since 1778, French military support had grown steadily. French troops under General Jean-Baptiste Donatien de Vimeur, Comte de Rochambeau, had arrived in Rhode Island in 1780. The French Navy, commanded in the Caribbean by Admiral François-Joseph Paul de Grasse, patrolled waters with increasing effectiveness. Coordination between American and French commanders was not always seamless. Language barriers, differing military traditions, and strategic disagreements complicated planning. Yet a shared objective bound them: strike a decisive blow against British forces before exhaustion or political shifts undermined the alliance. In the summer of 1781, Washington faced a choice. British General Sir Henry Clinton remained in New York with substantial forces. An assault there seemed logical but risky. Intelligence then suggested that Cornwallis had established a fortified position at Yorktown, Virginia, on a peninsula between the York and James Rivers. Yorktown offered Cornwallis access to the sea for resupply and evacuation, but it also presented vulnerability if naval escape were blocked. Washington and Rochambeau made a bold decision. Rather than attack New York, they would march south to Virginia, coordinating with de Grasse's fleet to trap Cornwallis. The movement required secrecy and speed. In August 1781, Allied forces began their march from New York toward the Chesapeake, masking their intentions from Clinton. Meanwhile, in early September, de Grasse's fleet engaged British naval forces at the Battle of the Chesapeake. The French victory prevented British ships from relieving Cornwallis. For the first time in the war, control of crucial waters shifted decisively away from Britain at a pivotal moment. By late September, Washington and Rochambeau had joined Lafayette near Yorktown. Approximately 17,000 American and French troops surrounded Cornwallis's 8,000 men. Siege operations commenced methodically. Trenches were dug under cover of darkness. Artillery positions were established. Cannon fire pounded British fortifications day after day. Earthworks crumbled. Morale inside Yorktown waned. British attempts to escape across the York River were thwarted by storms and French naval presence. Relief from New York did not arrive in time. On October 14th, Allied forces stormed key redoubts in a daring nighttime assault. American troops under Alexander Hamilton and French soldiers advanced with bayonets fixed, capturing the positions after intense fighting. With outer defences compromised and bombardment relentless, Cornwallis faced grim reality. On October 19, 1781, British forces marched out of Yorktown in surrender. Tradition holds that the British band played "The World Turned Upside Down," though the precise details remain debated. What is certain is that an entire British field army laid down its arms. The victory at Yorktown did not instantly end the war, but it shattered British political will. News of the defeat reached London in November. Parliament reeled. The cost of continuing the conflict, already immense, now seemed untenable. Prime Minister Lord North reportedly exclaimed upon hearing the news, "Oh God, it is all over." Negotiations would continue for nearly 2 more years. Minor skirmishes persisted, but Yorktown marked the decisive turning point. The Southern campaign, brutal and uncertain, had culminated in convergence. American endurance, French alliance, and British miscalculation, meeting at a single peninsula. What began as imperial enforcement in Georgia and the Carolinas had drawn British forces into overextension. What seemed at first a strategy of suppression had ended in entrapment. Across the former colonies, church bells rang again, not for petition or protest, but for triumph. Yet independence, though won in battle, still required formal recognition. War had forged a nation in struggle. Peace would define its future. When the drums fell silent at Yorktown and the smoke thinned above the battered earthworks, the world did not immediately feel changed. The autumn air still moved across the Virginia Peninsula with the same indifferent rhythm. The York River still carried its tides in and out beneath a pale sky. Soldiers still woke hungry, tired, and uncertain of what tomorrow would bring. And yet something irreversible had occurred. The surrender of General Charles Cornwallis on October 19th, 1781, was not merely the loss of a British army. It was the collapse of a strategy. For years, Britain had relied upon its ability to project force, to shift campaigns from north to south, to hold cities even if the countryside resisted. It had believed endurance favoured empire. Yorktown suggested otherwise. Cornwallis's army had not been annihilated in open battle. It had been cornered, besieged, and denied escape by coordination between American persistence and French power. The victory belonged not only to the Continental Army, but to diplomacy, alliance, and patience. When formal surrender ceremonies took place, British soldiers marched out between lines of French and American troops. Many observers remarked on the visible weariness in their ranks. They had fought across continents, oceans, and climates. Now they laid down their weapons in a land once considered firmly imperial. George Washington did not attend the surrender in person. Instead, his second in command, Benjamin Lincoln, accepted it. The gesture carried quiet symbolism. Lincoln himself had been forced to surrender Charleston in 1780. Now he received the submission of a British army. History, in that moment, felt balanced. Yet even amid celebration, leaders understood that the war was not technically over. British forces still occupied New York, Charleston, and Savannah. The Royal Navy still commanded vast stretches of ocean, and Britain remained a global power engaged in war not only with America, but with France and Spain. The American cause had achieved a decisive victory. It had not yet secured peace. In London, news of Yorktown triggered political upheaval. Lord North's ministry fell in early 1782. A new government more inclined toward negotiation took shape. The British public, weary of war expenses and uncertain of further benefit, increasingly favoured settlement. At the same time, American leaders recognised that alliance with France, though essential in war, carried its own complexities in peace. France had entered the conflict seeking to weaken Britain and recover prestige lost in 1763. French interests did not always align perfectly with American ambitions, particularly regarding Western territorial claims and fishing rights. Negotiations required delicacy. In Paris, American commissioners, including Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, undertook discussions with British representatives. Franklin, already admired in French society, moved skillfully within diplomatic circles. Adams pressed firmly for recognition of American independence and expansive boundaries. Jay, cautious and strategic, navigated suspicions that France might prioritize its own advantage. Talks unfolded slowly through 1782 and into 1783. One of the most significant issues concerned territory. The Americans sought recognition not only of independence, but of boundaries extending west to the Mississippi River, north to the Great Lakes, and south to Spanish Florida. Britain, eager to secure favorable trade relations in the future and to separate American interests from French and Spanish designs, proved more flexible than expected. On September 3rd, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain formally recognized the United States as free, sovereign, and independent. Boundaries were established largely along the lines American negotiators desired. Fishing rights off Newfoundland were secured. Debts owed to British creditors were to be honored. Loyalists were to face no further persecution, though implementation of that clause varied in practice. With ink upon parchment, the war concluded, but peace brought challenges of its own. The Continental Army, having endured years of hardship, faced demobilization. Soldiers who had fought for promised pay and pensions worried whether Congress, strapped for funds under the Articles of Confederation, could fulfill obligations. In 1783, unrest surfaced among officers encamped at Newburgh, New York. Frustration simmered over unpaid wages. Washington intervened personally. In a moving address to his officers, he appealed to their honor and patience. At one point, he paused to put on spectacles, remarking quietly that he had grown not only grey, but nearly blind in service to his country. The gesture, simple yet human, diffused tension. The so-called Newburgh conspiracy faded without violence. The moment mattered profoundly. In many revolutions throughout history, victorious generals have turned armies toward political power. Washington did not. In December 1783, he resigned his commission before Congress and returned to Mount Vernon. King George III, upon hearing of Washington's resignation, reportedly remarked that if true, he would be the greatest man in the world. The act reinforced a principle that would shape the new republic: civilian authority over the military. Across the former colonies, celebrations mixed with uncertainty. Towns marked the departure of British troops. In November 1783, British forces evacuated New York City, their last major foothold. American troops marched in as British ships withdrew. The war had lasted 8 long years. For ordinary citizens, its cost was visible in burned farms, disrupted trade, widowed families, and unsettled debts. Enslaved people who had sought freedom by fleeing to British lines faced uncertain futures. Some were evacuated with British forces to Nova Scotia or the Caribbean. Native nations, many of whom had allied with Britain in hopes of restraining colonial expansion, now confronted an American republic eager for Western lands. Independence for some meant dispossession for others. The Articles of Confederation, drafted during the war, now governed the fragile Union. They created a loose confederation of states with limited central authority. Congress could not levy direct taxes. It depended on state contributions. Economic instability persisted. Interstate disputes simmered. Victory in war had not automatically created effective governance. Yet something profound had taken root. The revolution had transformed subjects into citizens. It had introduced into political reality the assertion that governments derive legitimacy from the consent of the governed. The Declaration's language, once radical, now framed national identity. Ideas born in pamphlets and debated in assembly halls had survived battlefield testing. The American Revolution did not resolve all contradictions. Slavery remained entrenched in the southern states and present in the north. Women, though active in boycotts, camp management, and household economies, did not gain political rights in the new order. Native nations were excluded from the political compact entirely, and yet the revolution altered expectations. It expanded the vocabulary of rights. It suggested that empire was not immutable. In Europe and beyond, observers took note. The American example would echo in France within a decade. It would influence debates in Latin America and elsewhere in years to come. Back in the quiet towns where resistance first stirred, life resumed familiar rhythms. Fields were planted. Ships sailed under a new flag. Children grew up in a republic rather than a colony. The war that had begun with disputed taxes had reshaped a continent. The phrase often attributed to the British band at Yorktown, "The world turned upside down," captured more than theatrical irony. An empire had lost 13 colonies. A collection of colonies had become a nation. A king's authority had yielded to the principle of popular sovereignty. Yet revolutions are rarely clean transformations. They are layered with compromise, unfinished promises, and ongoing struggle. As the last British sails disappeared beyond the horizon in 1783, the American experiment truly began. Independence was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new and uncertain one. And in the quiet that followed cannon fire, beneath skies no longer ruled by imperial decree, a republic stood, unproven, imperfect, but undeniably real. Peace brought relief, but it did not bring ease. When the cannons quieted and British troops departed, the 13 former colonies faced a reality far more complex than the struggle that had united them. War had forged cooperation through necessity. Peace demanded cooperation by choice. And choice, history often shows, can be far more difficult. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 recognized independence and granted expansive territory stretching to the Mississippi River. On maps, the United States appeared vast and promising. In practice, much of that land remained contested ground. Native nations still occupied and defended their homelands. British forts lingered in parts of the Northwest Territory despite treaty terms. Spanish authorities controlled the Mississippi's mouth in New Orleans, limiting American access to crucial trade routes. The war had removed imperial oversight. It had not removed complexity. Under the Articles of Confederation, adopted during the war in 1781, the new nation functioned as a loose alliance of sovereign states. Congress could declare war, negotiate treaties, and manage Western lands, but it lacked authority to levy direct taxes. It depended upon voluntary contributions from states that often arrived late or not at all. Financial strain became immediate and persistent. The war had been financed through loans, foreign assistance, and the printing of paper currency. Continental dollars had depreciated severely during the conflict, giving rise to the phrase, "not worth a continental." Veterans returned home carrying certificates promising future payment. Farmers faced debts accumulated during years of disrupted trade. Economic dislocation ran deep. Each state pursued its own policies. Some imposed tariffs on goods from neighboring states. Currencies varied in value. Disputes over boundaries and trade regulations threatened unity. The sense of shared struggle that had bound the colonies during war began to thin under the pressures of local interest. In western Massachusetts during 1786 and 1787, economic distress erupted into open protest. Farmers burdened by debt and high state taxes, many of them veterans, faced foreclosure and imprisonment. Led by Daniel Shays, they organized resistance to court proceedings. What became known as Shays' Rebellion did not seek to overthrow the national government. It sought relief from economic hardship, yet the uprising alarmed political leaders across the states. The Confederation government lacked power to intervene directly. Massachusetts ultimately raised its own militia to suppress the rebellion. To many observers, the episode revealed the weakness of the existing system. If the national government could not maintain order or manage financial stability, could the Republic endure? Even before Shays' Rebellion, calls for reform had been growing. In 1786, delegates from several states met at Annapolis, Maryland, to discuss trade issues. The gathering was sparsely attended, but it issued a call for a broader convention to consider revisions to the Articles of Confederation. That convention convened in Philadelphia in May 1787. In the same Pennsylvania State House where independence had been debated 11 years earlier, delegates now gathered to address the structure of governance itself. George Washington presided, lending dignity and credibility to the proceedings. James Madison arrived with detailed plans for a stronger national framework. Alexander Hamilton advocated energetic federal authority. Others came cautious, determined to preserve state sovereignty. The task was delicate. Delegates quickly concluded that mere amendments to the Articles would not suffice. Instead, they drafted an entirely new constitution. Debate was intense and often contentious. Large states favored representation based on population. Smaller states demanded equal representation. The resulting compromise established a bicameral legislature, a House of Representatives apportioned by population, and a Senate granting equal representation to each state. Questions of executive power provoked careful scrutiny. Memories of monarchy were fresh, yet experience had shown that weak executive authority invited inefficiency. The Constitution created a single president, elected indirectly through an electoral college, empowered to enforce laws, command armed forces, and conduct foreign policy within defined limits. Judicial authority, too, was clarified through the establishment of a federal court system. But some of the most profound tensions centered on slavery. Southern states, whose economies depended heavily on enslaved labor, sought protections within the new framework. Northern delegates, though not uniformly opposed to slavery, faced moral and political complexity. The resulting compromises, counting enslaved persons as 3/5 of a person for representation and taxation, delaying any ban on the international slave trade until 1808. revealed the unfinished contradictions of the revolution. The Constitution was completed in September 1787 and submitted to the states for ratification. Debate erupted once more across newspapers and public meetings. Federalists argued that the new framework offered necessary strength and stability. Anti-Federalists warned of centralized power threatening liberty. To secure broader support, proponents promised amendments safeguarding individual rights. These would become the Bill of Rights, ratified in 1791, guaranteeing freedoms of speech, religion, press, assembly, and protection against arbitrary government action. By 1788, the Constitution achieved the necessary ratifications. In 1789, George Washington was inaugurated as the first President of the United States. The former Commander-in-Chief, who had once led a ragged army across frozen rivers, now took oath as head of a constitutional republic. The transition from revolution to governance had been neither automatic nor smooth. It required reflection, compromise, and renewed debate. The war had secured independence. The Constitution sought to secure durability. Yet even as institutions formed, the broader implications of the revolution continued unfolding. Native nations in the Ohio Valley resisted American expansion, leading to continued conflict. Western settlers pressed forward, eager for land promised by victory. The Mississippi River remained contested until the Pinckney Treaty of 1795 secured navigation rights with Spain. In the Atlantic world, the revolution's example reverberated. In 1789, the French Revolution erupted, inspired in part by American precedent, yet unfolding in far more radical and violent fashion. The language of rights and sovereignty spread, reshaping political discourse far beyond North America. At home, the young republic navigated fragile diplomacy between Britain and France. Former enemy and former ally now locked in renewed European war. The American Revolution, then, did not conclude neatly with surrender at Yorktown or signatures in Paris. It continued in constitutions drafted, debts negotiated, rebellions suppressed, compromises struck. It lived in the tension between liberty proclaimed and liberty practiced. For many citizens, daily life gradually resumed rhythms familiar yet altered. Taxes were now levied by representatives of their own choosing. Laws were debated in assemblies rather than decreed across an ocean. Flags bore new symbols. But the questions that had animated resistance — what is liberty? Who holds power? Who is included? — remained alive. The revolution had broken imperial bonds. It had declared that authority must rest upon consent. Whether that principle would be honored fully or only partially would shape generations to come. In the quiet years after war, beneath skies no longer shadowed by red-coated regiments, the United States stood as an experiment. It was an experiment born of protest, sustained by endurance and defined by aspiration. And like all experiments, its outcome would depend not only on the ideals written at its founding, but on the willingness of its people to live them. When the fighting ended and governments were formed, when signatures dried on parchment and soldiers returned to farms and workshops, the American Revolution did not simply fade into memory. It lingered in language, in expectation, in the quiet assumptions people carried about power and authority. Revolutions are often imagined as explosions, dramatic, violent ruptures that overturn one system and replace it with another. The American Revolution had certainly known violence. Muskets had cracked at Lexington. Cannons had thundered at Yorktown. Fields had burned in the Carolinas. Prisons had filled. Ships had sunk. But in another sense, the revolution unfolded more slowly, in conversations by hearthlight, in pamphlets passed hand to hand, in the steady internal shift from subject to citizen. Before 1776, most colonists did not imagine a world without monarchy. Even those who resisted Parliament often spoke warmly of the king. Authority, though distant, was assumed to flow downward from a crowned head. After independence, authority flowed upward, at least in theory, from the people themselves. That conceptual inversion was profound. It did not erase hierarchy. Wealth remained unevenly distributed. Social rank persisted. Enslavement endured. Women were largely excluded from formal political power. Indigenous nations were marginalized and displaced. Yet the intellectual foundation had shifted. The Declaration of Independence had asserted that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. The Constitution began with the words, "We, the people." Those phrases carried weight beyond their ink. In the early republic, citizens tested the boundaries of this new political identity. Newspapers flourished, political parties emerged, though many founders had warned against faction. Public debate became vigorous and sometimes bitter. Elections, once rare and limited in scope under imperial rule, became central rituals of civic life. The very act of disagreement within a shared constitutional framework marked something new. The revolution also altered relationships to land and expansion. With British restrictions lifted, settlers moved westward in increasing numbers. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 established a process for admitting new states into the Union, declaring that territories would not remain colonies, but could become equal members of the Republic. This approach was unprecedented. Empires traditionally held territories in subordinate status. The United States envisioned growth through incorporation. Yet, expansion came at tremendous cost to native nations, whose lands were claimed, negotiated away, or seized through force. The revolution's language of liberty did not extend fully to those outside its political compact. Slavery presented another profound contradiction. During the Revolutionary era, some northern states began gradual emancipation. Debates over the morality of slavery intensified. African Americans, both enslaved and free, invoked the revolution's ideals in petitions and public appeals. But in the southern states, slavery remained foundational to economic life. The Constitution protected its existence, embedding compromise at the heart of the new republic. Thus, the revolution carried within it both promise and paradox. Internationally, the American example traveled swiftly. In France, soldiers who had served alongside Washington returned home, carrying stories of Republican experiment. Financial strain from supporting the American war effort deepened France's own fiscal crisis. When revolution erupted there in 1789, American events were cited as precedent. Yet the French Revolution would follow a more turbulent and radical path, reminding observers that revolutions do not unfold identically. Context matters. History bends differently under different pressures. In Latin America, leaders such as Simón Bolívar later drew inspiration from the American struggle. Across the Atlantic world, monarchies faced renewed scrutiny. The American Revolution had demonstrated that colonial rebellion against a major European power could succeed. But perhaps its most enduring impact lay not in battlefield tactics or diplomatic maneuvers, but in imagination. It expanded the realm of the possible. Ordinary farmers and merchants had confronted one of the world's strongest empires and endured. Colonial assemblies had transformed into sovereign legislatures. A written constitution had been crafted not by a king's decree but by elected delegates. These developments encouraged future generations to question inevitability. In the decades following independence, Americans would argue fiercely about the meaning of their revolution. Federalists emphasized order and stability. Democratic Republicans stressed vigilance against concentrated power. Reformers invoked revolutionary principles to advocate broader suffrage. Abolitionists would later claim the Declaration's promise as incompatible with human bondage. Each generation returned to 1776 as reference point. Even memory itself became part of the Revolution's legacy. Veterans gathered for commemorations. Monuments were erected. Stories of Valley Forge and Saratoga entered national lore. Figures such as Washington, Franklin, Jefferson, Adams, and Hamilton became subjects of admiration and debate. The Revolution moved from lived experience into shared narrative. Yet for those who had endured its years directly, memory was more complicated. Widows remembered absence. Veterans carried scars. Loyalists who had fled to Canada or Britain remembered loss of home and property. Enslaved individuals who had hoped freedom would follow war often found continuity instead. History rarely grants unambiguous victory. The American Revolution succeeded in establishing independence. It created a republic that endured beyond the lifetimes of its founders. It articulated principles that reshaped political discourse. But it did not complete the work it began. The promise of equality would remain contested for centuries. The definition of citizenship would expand gradually and often painfully. The balance between liberty and order would be negotiated again and again. And perhaps that is the final truth of the revolution. It was not a single event concluded at Yorktown or sealed in Paris. It was a beginning, an opening of possibility, whose consequences continue to unfold. In quiet towns along the Atlantic coast, where protests once stirred and red-coated soldiers once marched, life eventually resumed patterns familiar, yet subtly transformed. Markets reopened, churches filled, ships departed under new flags. Children grew up reciting words that would have seemed radical only years before. They learned that authority came not from distant crowns, but from collective will. They inherited not only land and language, but expectation. Expectation that governments should be questioned. Expectation that power could be limited. Expectation that citizens, however imperfectly, possessed voice. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, and the generation of revolutionaries aged into memory, the United States remained an experiment, tested, amended, expanded, and challenged. The American Revolution had begun with grievances over taxes and representation. It ended by altering how millions understood sovereignty itself. Empires would rise and fall in the centuries to follow. Borders would shift. Technologies would transform daily life beyond anything imaginable in 1776. but the quiet assertion made in those years that a people might govern themselves continued to echo, and in that echo, long after muskets cooled and treaties were signed, the revolution endured. Long after the smoke of Yorktown had dissolved into clear autumn sky, long after the last British regiment departed New York Harbor in 1783, the American Revolution continued in ways less visible but no less powerful. Revolutions, once set in motion, do not simply conclude. They reverberate. They alter expectations. They shift the quiet assumptions beneath daily life. In the early years of the Republic, the landscape still bore the marks of conflict. Abandoned earthworks softened under grass. Cannonballs lay half buried in fields. Houses rebuilt after fire stood beside those that had survived intact. Memory lingered in place. Veterans aged quickly. Some carried visible wounds. Others bore injuries less easily seen. They gathered on anniversaries of battles, recalling hunger at Valley Forge, the long retreat across New Jersey, the thunder at Monmouth, the suffocating heat at Yorktown. Their stories, told and retold, formed the first threads of national memory. Yet memory was not uniform. For loyalists who had fled during the war, some 60,000 by modern estimates, the revolution meant exile. Many resettled in Canada, Nova Scotia, the Caribbean, or Britain itself. They rebuilt lives elsewhere, carrying with them bitterness or sorrow, sometimes both. To them, the revolution had not been liberation, but displacement. For native nations, the revolution's aftermath proved devastating. Many tribes, including the Iroquois Confederacy, had allied with Britain, believing imperial restraint offered better protection against colonial expansion. With British defeat, that restraint vanished. American settlers pressed westward into the Ohio Valley and beyond. Treaties were negotiated, broken, renegotiated. Warfare continued along frontiers for decades. The revolution had promised liberty. It delivered expansion. For enslaved African Americans, the war years had brought fragile hope. British proclamations had offered freedom to those who fled rebel masters and joined imperial lines. Thousands took that risk. Some were evacuated with British forces at war's end, resettling in Nova Scotia or Sierra Leone. Others remained enslaved in the new United States. In the northern states, gradual emancipation laws began to dismantle slavery slowly, over generations. In the South, slavery deepened, especially as cotton cultivation expanded in the decades to come. The revolution's rhetoric of equality echoed loudly, yet its application remained uneven. And still, despite contradictions, something transformative had occurred. The notion that legitimate government required consent had entered common political language. The written constitution, amendable yet enduring, provided a framework for argument without dissolution. Disputes that might once have provoked rebellion could now unfold within institutional structure. Political parties emerged quickly in the 1790s. Federalists and Democratic Republicans, despite early warnings that faction could destroy Republican virtue. Newspapers aligned openly with competing visions of the nation's future. Debate became intense, sometimes deeply personal, yet the existence of structured opposition itself testified to revolutionary change. In 1800, when Thomas Jefferson defeated John Adams in a bitterly contested presidential election, the transfer of power occurred peacefully. No army intervened, no crown imposed order. authority shifted through ballots rather than bullets. Jefferson would later call it a revolution of 1800. Not because blood was shed, but because political power changed hands within constitutional bounds. The habits formed during the struggle against Britain had shaped expectations of accountability. Leaders were scrutinised, laws were contested, public opinion mattered. Abroad, observers watched carefully. In Europe, monarchs regarded the American experiment with a mixture of skepticism and unease. If 13 colonies could detach themselves from empire and endure, what precedent did that set? The French Revolution, far more violent and socially transformative, drew partly upon American example, yet diverged sharply in execution. Its upheavals reminded the world that revolutions could consume themselves. The American path, though not free from conflict, appeared comparatively restrained. By the early 19th century, Latin American independence movements invoked both American and French precedents. Figures such as Simón Bolívar studied constitutional models and revolutionary rhetoric. The age of empire had not ended, but its inevitability had been challenged. Within the United States, westward expansion accelerated. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 doubled the nation's size. Explorers ventured toward the Pacific. Settlers followed rivers and trails into lands that maps only partially described. The Revolution had opened a continental future, yet that future carried unresolved tensions embedded from the beginning. Sectional divisions between North and South widened over time, especially regarding slavery and economic policy. Debates that had been temporarily contained in constitutional compromise would re-emerge with greater intensity in the 19th century. The Civil War, nearly 80 years after independence, would test the Republic's durability more severely than the Revolution itself. And still, the foundational ideas articulated in 1776 remain touchstones. Abraham Lincoln, during the Civil War, would invoke the Declaration of Independence, arguing that the nation was conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. In that moment of profound crisis, revolutionary language provided moral anchor. The revolution's endurance lay not only in its victories, but in its vocabulary. It provided a grammar for dissent, movements for abolition, for women's rights, for expanded suffrage, and later for civil rights would all draw upon revolutionary principles. Petitioners would ask how a nation founded on equality could deny participation to half its population. Reformers would cite the Declaration as both promise and indictment. Thus, the revolution became both origin and argument. In quieter ways, it reshaped daily life. Titles of nobility found no place in the new republic. Citizens addressed one another with a different tone of equality, at least in theory. Religious freedom, protected by constitutional amendment, allowed pluralism uncommon in many European states at the time. Education expanded gradually, grounded in the belief that a republic required informed citizens. Public schooling, though uneven, grew as part of that vision. Even architecture reflected change. Public buildings adopted classical forms inspired by ancient republics, rather than Gothic grandeur associated with monarchy. Symbols mattered. Columns and domes suggested continuity with Rome and Athens, not London. As decades passed, the generation that had fought the war dwindled. The last veterans died in the early 19th century. What had been living memory became history. Yet the revolution did not recede entirely into abstraction. Every 4th of July, bells rang and speeches were delivered. Parades marched through streets once patrolled by British soldiers. Fireworks illuminated skies over cities that had once known siege. Commemoration sustained continuity, and beneath celebration lay something quieter. The American Revolution had proven that a people could reimagine their political relationship to power. It had shown that empire was not eternal. It had demonstrated that ideals, when combined with organization, sacrifice, and alliance, could reshape reality. It had also revealed that liberty declared is not liberty fully realized. The story did not conclude with perfection. It concluded with possibility. As the Republic matured, faltered, expanded, and endured, it carried forward the tensions of its birth. It remained an experiment, vulnerable yet persistent. The echo of 1776 was never a single note. It was a sustained resonance, sometimes triumphant, sometimes discordant, reminding each generation that sovereignty rests not in distant authority, but in collective responsibility. And so, the American Revolution endures not merely as a sequence of battles and treaties, but as an ongoing conversation. A conversation about power, a conversation about rights, a conversation about who belongs within the promise first written in defiance. The muskets have long since cooled. The parchment has long since aged. But the questions asked in those years still wait for answers, carried forward beneath the quiet sky of a nation born in revolution. When revolutions end, there is no trumpet that sounds the final note. There is only quiet. After years defined by alarm bells, marching boots, cannon smoke, and urgent debate, the quiet that followed the American Revolution must have felt almost unfamiliar. No riders arrived at midnight with warnings of advancing regiments. No warships darkened harbours with threat. No proclamations from a distant king altered the course of daily life. Instead, morning returned in ordinary ways. Sunlight spilled across fields in Massachusetts, where Minutemen had once assembled. Tidewater lapped gently at Virginia shores, where armies had converged. Church doors opened on Sundays without fear of occupation. Markets filled not with rumour of battle, but with vegetables, cloth, tools, and grain. The storm had passed. Yet storms change landscapes. The United States that emerged from the Revolution was not simply a former colony freed from imperial rule. It was something newly imagined, a republic founded not on inherited authority, but on articulated principle. That difference mattered. In monarchies, sovereignty descended. In the American Republic, sovereignty ascended, from the people upward. It was a fragile idea at first, tested repeatedly, but once spoken and enacted, it could not easily be withdrawn. Children born in the 1780s and 1790s grew up in a world where elections were routine, where presidents served fixed terms, where newspapers criticized leaders openly. These practices, once radical, became customary. The revolution had normalized participation. Even language shifted. The word citizen replaced subject. That single change captured the transformation in political identity. A subject owes allegiance. A citizen possesses agency. Agency would not be evenly distributed, and struggles for inclusion would stretch across centuries. But the conceptual foundation had been laid. Looking back, Historians would later debate the nature of the American Revolution. Some would emphasize its conservatism, noting that many colonial elites retained power after independence, that social hierarchies endured. Others would highlight its radicalism, the rejection of monarchy, the creation of a written constitution, the insistence that legitimacy derived from consent. Both interpretations hold truth. The revolution was restrained in some respects and transformative in others. It avoided the sweeping social upheaval that marked France in 1789. It did not dissolve class distinctions entirely, but it fundamentally altered the source of authority and the expectations of governance. Perhaps its greatest achievement lay in durability. Many revolutions burn brightly and collapse. The American experiment persisted. It amended itself. It survived internal division. It expanded across a continent. It endured civil war and reconstruction. It adapted through industrialization and global conflict. Each generation reinterpreted its founding moment. In times of crisis, leaders returned to the Declaration of Independence. In times of reform, activists invoked the promise of equality. In times of doubt, the Constitution served as anchor. The revolution became a reference point, not a finished chapter, but beginning continuously revisited. And yet, in the quiet spaces between anniversaries and speeches, its legacy lived in subtler forms. It lived in the expectation that leaders answer to voters. It lived in the assumption that laws can be debated and revised. It lived in the idea that disagreement need not mean disintegration. These habits, once revolutionary, became ordinary. But it is worth remembering how improbable they once seemed. In 1775, 13 colonies stood divided by geography, economy, religion, and custom. They possessed no standing national army, no established treasury, no unified identity beyond loose allegiance to Britain. Few could have predicted that within a decade they would declare independence, win a global war, draft a constitution, and inaugurate a president chosen without bloodshed. History often appears inevitable in hindsight. In its moment, it is anything but. The American Revolution might have failed at many points. It might have fractured into regional conflicts. It might have succumbed to British military power. It might have dissolved under financial strain. Instead, it endured. Not because victory was certain, but because persistence proved stronger than prediction. And so, when we look back across the long arc from Lexington's first uncertain shot to the steady transfer of power in the early Republic, we see more than battlefields and treaties. We see a gradual awakening to the idea that people could shape their political destiny. That awakening did not resolve every injustice. It did not eliminate inequality. It did not guarantee wisdom in governance. But it altered the horizon of possibility. Under night skies in the years after independence, when candles were extinguished and households settled into rest, the Republic remained fragile but real. The world beyond its borders remained uncertain. Challenges lay ahead. Economic turmoil, partisan conflict, foreign entanglement, sectional tension. Yet beneath those challenges lay a foundation poured in revolution. The empire that once governed from across the sea had faded from daily life. In its place stood a nation responsible for itself. Responsibility is heavier than rebellion. It lacks the clarity of opposition. It demands patience where revolution demands courage. And still, the United States accepted that burden. The American Revolution was not merely a war for independence. It was a redefinition of sovereignty. It was a declaration that authority must answer to those it governs. It was a claim, imperfectly fulfilled, endlessly debated, that liberty is not granted from above, but secured from within. The muskets have long since rusted. The camps at Valley Forge have long since vanished into grass. The ships that carried British troops home have long since returned to dust. But the questions asked in that era remain alive wherever people consider the nature of power. Who governs? By what right? With whose consent? In those questions, the revolution endures. And as history continues to unfold, generation after generation, the quiet after the storm reminds us that the work of liberty is never finished, only carried forward. If one were to walk through the American countryside in the years just after independence, nothing about the soil would reveal that a revolution had occurred. The same wind moved across fields of corn and tobacco. The same rivers traced their quiet paths toward the sea. The same stars shone over wooden farmhouses and brick townhomes. And yet, the people beneath those stars were living inside an unfinished promise. The revolution had declared that all men are created equal. It had insisted that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. It had framed liberty not as privilege, but as birthright. But ideals written in ink do not immediately transform reality. In the southern states, slavery remained embedded in law and economy. Enslaved men, women, and children had heard the language of liberty. Some had fought in the war. Some had fled to British lines seeking freedom. Some had petitioned legislatures using the rhetoric of natural rights. Yet for most, daily life after 1783 resembled daily life before it. The contradiction was visible, but unresolved. In northern states, gradual emancipation laws began to chip away at slavery's legal structure. Children born after certain dates would be freed upon reaching adulthood. It was a cautious, incremental approach, less rupture, more transition. Still, even in the North, racial equality remained distant. The revolution had opened a moral argument that would echo for generations. It had not completed it. Women, too, had participated in the revolutionary struggle. They had organized boycotts, produced homespun cloth, managed farms in the absence of husbands, and in some cases followed armies as camp supporters. Figures like Abigail Adams had urged lawmakers to remember the ladies when forming new laws. Yet, formal political rights did not follow. The concept of Republican motherhood emerged, the belief that women played a vital role in raising virtuous citizens for the Republic. Education for women expanded somewhat under this logic, but suffrage, legal independence, and full civic equality remained out of reach. Again, the promise had been spoken. It had not yet been fulfilled. For native nations, the revolution proved devastating. With British power removed, there was no imperial buffer restraining colonial expansion westward. Settlers moved into the Ohio Valley and beyond with increasing momentum. Treaties were often negotiated under pressure or ignored outright. Armed conflict resumed in the Northwest Territory during the 1790s. The revolution had secured American independence. It had not secured indigenous sovereignty. Even loyalists, those who had remained faithful to the crown, bore the revolution's consequences. Many who stayed in the United States faced confiscation of property, social suspicion, or exile. Some reintegrated quietly, others rebuilt lives elsewhere in the British Empire. Victory, like liberty, was unevenly distributed. And yet, despite these unresolved tensions, the revolution had done something irreversible. It had created a language powerful enough to challenge its own limitations. Abolitionists would later quote the Declaration Against Slavery. Women's rights advocates at Seneca Falls in 1848 would model their Declaration of Sentiments directly on Jefferson's words. Civil rights leaders centuries later would stand on the same rhetorical ground, asking the nation to live up to its founding creed. The revolution had not solved injustice. It had made injustice harder to justify. That distinction mattered. In monarchies, inequality could be defended as tradition, as divine order, as inevitability. In a republic founded on equality, inequality demanded explanation. It required argument. It invited challenge. And so the revolution became not a completed act, but a measuring standard. Each generation would hold the nation against its founding ideals and ask, are we yet what we declared ourselves to be? That question is not quiet. It is not gentle, but it is enduring. In the decades after independence, as political parties formed and dissolved, as territories became states, as industry began to hum in northern cities and cotton plantations expanded in the south, the republic continued to grow. It grew in confidence. It grew in contradiction. It grew in ambition. Foreign observers remained uncertain whether it would last. Some predicted fragmentation. Others expected monarchy to return in different form. But the constitutional framework held. Power transferred without coups. Disputes unfolded within institutions. Amendments were debated rather than battles fought, at least for a time. The revolution had replaced inherited sovereignty with constructed sovereignty. That construction required maintenance. It required participation. It required vigilance. And perhaps that is the deepest truth of it. The American Revolution was not a door that opened once and remained open forever. It was a hinge. It allowed movement. It permitted correction. It created space for argument about what liberty should mean. In quiet evenings across the young nation, parents told children stories of Lexington and Yorktown. They described frostbitten soldiers at Valley Forge and daring crossings of icy rivers. They spoke of courage and sacrifice. But beneath those stories lay something even more lasting than bravery. It is the belief that ordinary people could question power and reshape it. That belief would not remain confined to one century. It would travel forward, resurfacing whenever citizens felt authority drift too far from consent. The revolution had ended a war, but it had begun a standard, one by which the nation would judge itself again and again. And that standard, once spoken, could never fully be silenced. Long after the last veteran of the revolution had been laid to rest, long after the ink of the Constitution had faded into archival parchment, the American Revolution continued to travel. It traveled not by ship or cannon, but by idea. In the closing years of the 18th century, Europe stood uneasy. Monarchies governed vast populations. Thrones were justified by tradition, by divine right, by lineage stretching backward through centuries. The American experiment, a republic born from colonial resistance, seemed improbable, even fragile, and yet it endured. When news of American independence first reached European courts, reactions were cautious. Some saw rebellion, others saw opportunity to weaken Britain. But as the United States survived its early instability, as elections occurred without collapse, as leadership transferred peacefully, observers began to recognize something more enduring than insurgency. They saw viability. In France, soldiers who had fought alongside Americans returned home carrying stories not only of battle, but of political philosophy made practical. The financial burden France had assumed in aiding the American cause strained its treasury, contributing to crisis. By 1789, revolution erupted in Paris. The French Revolution would move more swiftly, more violently, more unpredictably than its American predecessor. Kings would fall, heads would roll. The reign of terror would darken ideals with blood. And yet, in its earlier stages, the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen echoed familiar language. Liberty, equality, sovereignty of the people. The American Revolution had helped demonstrate that such language could be enacted. Beyond France, the ripple widened. In Haiti, enslaved people rose in revolt in 1791, inspired partly by revolutionary ideals and partly by the contradictions exposed in French colonial rule. The Haitian Revolution would become the only successful large-scale slave revolt in modern history, creating the first Black Republic in the Western Hemisphere. In Spanish and Portuguese America, independence movements would follow in the early 19th century. Leaders like Simón Bolívar studied republican models and constitutional frameworks emerging from the United States. Though each movement had distinct causes and trajectories, the American example offered proof that colonial rule could be challenged and replaced. The Atlantic world shifted. The American Revolution did not single-handedly cause this transformation. Economic pressures, Enlightenment thought, demographic change, and imperial rivalries all played roles. But the American experience became a reference point, a case study in successful resistance and republican construction. It suggested that empires were not permanent fixtures of human order. Yet even as the United States inspired others, it confronted its own unresolved contradictions. Territorial expansion accelerated in the early 19th century. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 extended American claims across vast lands inhabited by native nations. Expansion brought opportunity for settlers, but displacement for indigenous peoples. The rhetoric of liberty coexisted with policies of removal. In 1830, the Indian Removal Act would authorize forced relocation of native tribes from southeastern lands to territories west of the Mississippi. The trail of tears that followed revealed the distance between revolutionary ideals and governmental action. Similarly, slavery's persistence deepened sectional division. Cotton production flourished after the invention of the cotton gin in 1793, entrenching enslaved labor in the Southern economy. Political compromises attempted to balance free and slave states, but tension mounted steadily. The Civil War, erupting in 1861, would force the nation to confront its founding paradox directly. In that conflict, leaders again invoked 1776. Abraham Lincoln framed the war as a test of whether a nation conceived in liberty could long endure. The Revolution had provided the language of aspiration. The Civil War would attempt to redefine its application. In later centuries, waves of immigration brought millions to American shores. many came drawn by the promise articulated in the founding era that governance rested on consent. That opportunity existed beyond inherited class. The revolution became part of civic mythology, but also part of civic expectation. Globally, movements for self-determination in the 19th and 20th centuries often cited the American model among their influences. From Greece to Latin America, from post-colonial Africa to Asia, leaders studied constitutional frameworks and declarations of rights. The American Revolution did not offer a universal template. Its context was specific. Its outcomes were shaped by geography, demographics, and global politics. But it offered something intangible yet powerful: precedent. Precedent that colonized people could assert independence. Precedent that written constitutions could organize governance. Precedent that peaceful transfer of power could follow violent upheaval. Back within the United States, the revolution's symbols remained potent. The Liberty Bell, cracked but preserved, became emblem of endurance. The image of Washington crossing the Delaware, whether historically precise or artistically dramatized, symbolized courage against odds. Fireworks on the 4th of July illuminated more than night sky. They illuminated continuity. Yet for all the pageantry, the revolution's most enduring contribution may be quieter. It normalized the expectation that governments can be reformed or replaced by collective will. That expectation carries risk. It can inspire noble reform or reckless instability. It can embolden democratic participation or justify radical upheaval. But once introduced into political consciousness, it cannot easily be erased. In the centuries since 1783, the United States has changed in ways unimaginable to those who gathered in Philadelphia in 1776. The population has grown from millions to hundreds of millions. Technology has transformed communication, transportation, and warfare. The nation has become a global power. And still, the foundational questions remain rooted in that earlier moment. What is liberty? Who defines it? Who participates in its protection? How is authority limited? The American Revolution did not answer these questions definitively. It made them central. Across oceans, across decades, across continents, the light first kindled in colonial protest continued to flicker. Sometimes bright, sometimes dim, but rarely extinguished. And so the revolution's story extends far beyond musket smoke and battlefield surrender. It lives in constitutions drafted in distant lands. It lives in speeches invoking rights and consent. It lives in citizens who believe their voices matter. Empires rise and fall. Ideas travel further. And among the ideas that crossed the Atlantic in the 18th century, few would travel as far or endure as long as the claim that power belongs not to crowns, but to the people. The American Revolution began in resistance. It continued in reflection. And its light, once lit, crossed waters far beyond the shores where it was born. If we step back now, slowly, and let the noise of battle fade entirely, the American Revolution begins to look less like a sequence of dramatic flashes and more like a long breath drawn across years. It began not with certainty, but with unease, a tax on paper, a duty on tea, a regiment quartered in a restless town, snow falling on King Street, a musket discharging in early morning light on Lexington Green. At the time, no one standing in those moments could see the full shape of what was forming. Farmers gathered with muskets did not know they were stepping into the first pages of a global transformation. Delegates debating in Philadelphia did not know their words would echo centuries later. Soldiers shivering at Valley Forge did not know whether their endurance would mean victory or only survival. History rarely announces its turning points with clarity. It unfolds quietly, often uncertainly, through decisions made by people who cannot see beyond their own horizon. And yet, when viewed across distance, a pattern emerges. The revolution was not inevitable. It was not guaranteed. It was not ordained by destiny. It was shaped by choices. Cautious choices. Bold choices. Desperate choices. Made in moments of tension and doubt. There were points at which it could have failed. After the rout in New York, when Washington's army dwindled and enlistments expired, the cause might have dissolved into exhaustion. After the fall of Charleston, the Southern campaign might have broken morale entirely. After years of inflation and unpaid wages, the army might have fractured from within, but it did not. Instead, it bent without breaking. The revolution endured because enough people, farmers, merchants, soldiers, writers, diplomats, believed the idea beneath it was worth persistence. Not perfection, not certainty, but persistence. And that idea, at its simplest, was this: authority must answer to those it governs. That assertion challenged centuries of inherited structure. It did not eliminate hierarchy or injustice. It did not immediately expand liberty to all, but it planted a principle that would resist easy suppression. The revolution also revealed something deeply human about power. Empires appear vast and immovable. Their flags fly across oceans. Their armies march in disciplined lines. Their laws extend across continents. But empires depend upon consent as surely as republics do, even if that consent is reluctant or assumed. When consent fractures, authority must either reform or enforce. Britain chose enforcement. The colonies chose resistance. Between those choices lay 8 years of war. When Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown, it was not simply a battlefield defeat. It was recognition that force alone couldn't restore what had been altered. The relationship between ruler and ruled had changed. Yet perhaps the most remarkable moment of the revolution did not occur in battle at all. It occurred when George Washington resigned his commission. After leading an army through hardship and triumph, he relinquished power voluntarily. He did not crown himself. He did not seize control. He stepped away. In that act, quiet and restrained, the revolution affirmed its own purpose. The goal had never been to replace one ruler with another. It had been to redefine rule itself. As years passed and the Constitution was drafted, debated, and ratified, the young republic institutionalized what the revolution had fought to secure. Power would be divided, authority would be limited, rights would be enumerated. It was an imperfect structure, born of compromise and contradiction, but it held, and holding is no small achievement. Across centuries, many revolutions have burned fiercely, only to collapse into tyranny or fragmentation. The American experiment endured not because it avoided conflict, but because it created mechanisms to manage it. Disagreement became lawful rather than lethal. Elections replaced coups. Amendments replaced insurrection. That transformation from violent rupture to structured argument may be the revolution's most enduring legacy. Yet as we reflect, it is important to remember that the revolution did not belong solely to famous names carved into marble. It belonged to unnamed soldiers who marched barefoot, to women who spun cloth in quiet defiance, to printers who risked prosecution for inked words, to farmers who left fields to stand in uncertain lines, to enslaved people who heard liberty spoken and dared to hope, to indigenous nations who watched empires shift around them. The revolution touched each differently. For some, it brought expanded freedom. For others, displacement. For many, complexity beyond easy summary. And perhaps that is fitting. No revolution resolves all contradictions. It begins conversations that outlive its founders. The American Revolution began as a protest against policy. It became a war for independence. It matured into a framework for governance. And it evolved into a standard against which the nation would measure itself again and again. That measurement continues. Whenever citizens debate the limits of authority, they stand in its shadow. Whenever rights are asserted, they echo its language. Whenever peaceful power changes hands, they reaffirm its principle. The long breath drawn in 1775 did not end in 1783. It continues still. And now, as we near the quiet close of this long journey through history, we can see the revolution not as a distant spectacle, but as a living foundation. It was made by ordinary people facing extraordinary uncertainty. It survived because enough of them chose endurance over surrender. It remains because the questions it raised remain alive. The wind that once carried the scent of gunpowder across colonial fields now moves softly over towns and cities built in its aftermath. The muskets are silent. The parchment has aged, but the idea that power rests ultimately with the people continues to breathe. Now, at last, the noise has faded completely. No drums roll in the distance. No cannon answer across the water. No rider gallops through the night carrying urgent warning. Only quiet. If we return in our minds to that long Atlantic coastline of the 18th century, to the wooden docks of Boston, the tobacco fields of Virginia, the narrow streets of Philadelphia, we find those places no longer trembling with uncertainty, but resting in the slow rhythm of ordinary life. The revolution has passed through them like a storm, and what remains is not the storm itself, but the altered air afterward. The American Revolution did not create perfection. It did not erase injustice or prevent future conflict. It did not resolve every contradiction written into its founding moment. But it did something that endures more quietly than gunfire. It shifted belief. Before the revolution, power flowed downward, from king to parliament, from empire to colony. Afterward, power flowed upward, at least in principle. From citizen to representative, from governed to government. That reversal changed the architecture of expectation. It meant that authority could be questioned without treason. It meant that laws could be amended without rebellion. It meant that leadership could change without blood. Those ideas were fragile at first. They required reinforcement. They required structure. They required trust that disagreement would not unravel the whole. And over time, they became habits. The revolution's greatest legacy may not be found in monuments or battlefields, but in that habit, the habit of self-government, when voters stand in quiet lines to cast ballots, when courts interpret written law, when citizens gather to debate public questions, when peaceful transitions of power occur without soldiers in the streets. In those moments, the revolution breathes. It is easy, across centuries, to imagine history as distant and sealed. But the American Revolution is not sealed. It remains unfinished in its promise, ongoing in its implications. The words written in 1776 still ask something of the present. The Constitution drafted in 1787 still shapes daily life. The choice made at Yorktown to end a war and begin a republic still echoes in every act of civic participation. And yet, beneath all of this, there is something gentler. The revolution was not only grand speeches and decisive battles. It was also ordinary endurance. It was long nights of doubt. It was hunger, cold, fatigue, uncertainty. It was human beings choosing persistence without knowing the outcome. That human scale is what makes it real. A farmer standing on Lexington Green could not see 2 centuries ahead. A soldier crossing the Delaware could not imagine a continental nation stretching to the Pacific. A delegate signing the Declaration could not foresee generations invoking his words in struggles yet unborn. They acted within their moment. And that is enough. History does not ask its participants to see the future. It asks only that they meet the present with courage. The American Revolution was such a meeting. It began with grievance, moved through sacrifice, and settled into structure. It created a nation not by certainty, but by conviction tested over time. Now, as we let this long story come gently to rest, imagine once more the quiet coastline at dusk. The tide moves in and out, as it did before empire, before rebellion, before independence. The sky darkens into deep blue. Stars appear, the same stars that shone over soldiers at Valley Forge and delegates in Philadelphia. The world feels still. And somewhere within that stillness lies the simple, enduring truth born in those turbulent years, that people may shape their own governance, that authority may answer to consent, that liberty, though imperfect and unfinished, is worth the long effort it requires. The muskets have fallen silent. The treaties have been signed. The generation of founders has long since passed into memory, but the quiet that followed their storm remains. And in that quiet, the revolution endures, not as noise, but as foundation. Let the story rest there. Let it settle. And as the night deepens and the world grows still, allow the echoes of history to soften into calm. A reminder that even the loudest upheavals can give way to lasting peace. The storm has passed. The nation breathes. And the quiet remains.